Sure, you can tell a story. How do you engage the audience and pull them in and get them interested in the story? How do you make sure you're telling the right story to the right audience? That was the question that my speech coach put to me. Bob, he said, I was trying to develop stories. I knew that stories were important. I was thinking, okay, I've got to do a story because stories pull people in. It's great. And I had some sort of idea about what story to do and how it goes. But I started talking with Bob. I started saying, Bob, I don't know. I know I've got to tell a story, but I'm not quite sure where it's going to go or how it's going to work out. Bob said, Tim, before you even begin the story, what's the effect you want to create from your story? Bob, what do you mean, what's the effect you want to create from the story? I just want to tell a story. Tim, you use time differently in different stories depending upon what effect you want to create. Well, that was news to me. Never thought about time that way before. I knew you could speed up time, collapse time. I got that, but this was a new idea. One I hadn't thought about. How does time work in stories? And then Bob started explaining more. I started to understand a little bit more about in stories this kind of complexity to stories, and that stories don't have to have the same sort of time you might expect. So today, you're going to find out about 3 different types of stories that use 3 different types of time movement. One of them you're probably very familiar with, but there's something in even the simplest example of a story many people don't get. Because of that, their stories are flat, uninteresting, and boring. Another way of using time is something that maybe you understand, and it's very useful for particular types of speeches. The third type of time is something used less often, and probably you never really thought about it, but in certain situations can be very effective in getting across that story. So, if you want to get a point across, it makes sense to tell a story. You probably know that. Maybe you've heard that before. Make a point, tell a story, make another point, tell another story. Have you heard that? Well, if you haven't heard that, you heard it now. When you tell that story, the way you use time and the way you move back and forth in time is very important and very powerful. Use time in the wrong way for the wrong story, and it won't have that effect that you want. Because of that, the story won't make the impact you want to make. And very often, many speakers, most speakers, they're telling stories, tell stories in a way that don't really get the effect they want to produce. And as a result, their speeches don't have quite the impact, the motivation they want them to have. So today you're going to learn about how to avoid those types of mistakes. You're going to find out about 3 different ways to use time in a story, and learn about when it's appropriate to use which one, depending on what sort of effect you want to create. Find out about the mistakes most speakers make when they're speaking and telling stories, and how you can make sure you don't make that mistake. Start out with a very basic story. A story you've probably heard before, a story structure you're probably very familiar with. From that, move to something that's a little bit different. A little bit different from the way you think of stories. Finally, talk about a way to do stories that can be very effective if done correctly. But for stories, perhaps it makes sense to begin at the beginning. when you're telling a story, there's one simple way to tell a story most people naturally use. Simple, natural, effective way to tell stories. It's the way you started out doing it as a kid. You're telling stories. It's the way you kept doing it as an adult. The way you probably still do it today. Simple, powerful, and useful in certain situations if you know how to do the story effectively. And that is to begin at the beginning of the story. So one way to use time is to focus on the beginning. Just tell your story all the way through. Start at the beginning, all the way through to the end. Simple. Effective way to tell a story. Got a story to tell? Okay, fine. We'll tell it at the very beginning. And we'll go all the way through to the end. Something like, when I was a kid growing up, I had different challenges in life. I went out to the school and met with the other kids, and sometimes they were nice and sometimes they weren't nice. You get the idea. You just follow that story all the way through. And a lot of speakers tell stories like that. Just begin at the beginning, go all the way through. The problem is, quite often something's missing from the story. And because that thing's missing from the story, instead of just telling a story, you're telling a boring story. A story that doesn't really go anywhere, not really going to do anything. And unfortunately, it's common for a lot of speakers to tell boring stories because they're missing this element. Very simple to fix, but if not there, it's a problem. And that is conflict. If you have a story with no conflict, you have a boring story. Once you put conflict into a story, then things get interesting. You can take that same story as a child wasn't very strong, challenging, going amongst the other kids, and I had a habit of kind of hiding, afraid that somebody would hit me. Then one day, somebody did. Beginning of a story. The child, everything's going along, everything's, not great, but worrying about things. That's the first tension, that's the first conflict, internal conflict. And then, afraid someone's going to hit him. Okay. And then, they do. Conflict drives the story. So then you want to know, okay, who hit him? Why? What'd you do about it? How did you handle it? That drives the story all the way through. So as long as you have conflict, beginning at the beginning is fine. You want to tell a story, get people involved, pull them in, great. Just make sure there's some sort of conflict, some sort of challenge to be overcome that you can talk about later in the story. Then beginning at the beginning is fine. Just develop that conflict. The thing about conflict, it has to build and build and build. So if you get hit, fine, okay. But if that's the only time you get hit in the story, well, that's it. I get hit, and then I went home, and I thought about it, I went there, and I decided I was going to hit back. Okay, that increases the conflict. So I went back, and I found the guy hit me, and I slammed him. Builds that conflict. What's the other guy going to do? Fight going to break out right then? It's going to go away. That builds the conflict. Building that conflict builds the story. So, simple way to use time in a story is from the beginning, all the way through to the end. Just tell a story at the beginning, all the way through to the end. That will work provided you have conflict. Sometimes, you don't want to just tell a story. You want to make that point. And the point you want to make is that you got something you want people to do. And if you got something you want people to do, it helps to tell the story a little bit differently. Well, telling a story from the beginning all the way through to the end is fine, provided you have conflict, you make the story interesting. If you want to really sell something, or promote something, or really get something going, so you get people buying your product or your service or whatever it is you're selling, just telling a story at the beginning all the way through to the end just is not going to work. For that, you need to do something just a little bit differently. And that's what I learned from Bob, speech coach. Bob taught me that, Tim, if you want to get that story really going, and you want to get people hooked in and buying what you got to sell, you can begin the story at the end. At the end. Maybe you've never thought of that. Maybe you were like me. I thought, well, when you tell a story, you go from the beginning to get to the end. But if the whole point is how you went from rags to riches, if you spend 25 minutes on how you're all in rags, the audience is not going to care. It's not going to matter to them. They're going to say, hey, sure, fine, you're in rags, but big deal. Anybody can be in rags. What's really the point? What do you really get out of this? That's why you take the end, put it at the beginning. So if you're telling a rags to riches story, you start at the end. Where does the story end up? Right, with riches. Where does the story begin? With rags. Exactly. Now, put the end at the beginning. How does the story, then when you start the story, what do you talk about? Yeah, exactly. Riches. And you've probably heard these things. They're used by infomercials all the time. They start out, I'm a millionaire today, but I wasn't always. 10 years ago, I had no money, no job, no prospects, and I was just out there begging for my next meal. Have you heard those stories? Probably have. Notice they begin with the end. Right at the very end. So, okay, first I'm going to start out by saying, here's how I am today. That's the end of my story. I'm all rich, successful. Then they start at the beginning. Then they go to the beginning. But I was with these rags. And I went all the way up to here. And they do that because they want you to ask the question, one question in your mind. How? How did you go from nothing to everything? How did you go from where you were to where you ended up now? Well, the only way the audience will care about that if you explain right at the beginning that, hey, this is where I am now. This is how I got there. That's, if you want to sell somebody, something to somebody, you want to convince them to somebody. I learned from Bob that begin with the end. Right at the very beginning. Just right at the first thing in your story you start about, okay, here's where I am now. I'm successful, I've got this great job, I've got this great life, but wasn't always that way. I started out maybe where you're starting out. Not happy, unhappy with my life, unhappy with my job, not making as much money as I wanted to. Here. Automatically, by beginning with the end and then building up to that, you say, how did you do it? Now, if you just told the story from the beginning, I was poor and poor and poor and poor, no one's going to listen to all that poor stuff. They want to know about the success. It's easy to be a failure. People want to know, how did you achieve that success? So the first thing to let them know is you're successful. The next thing to let them know is that you're developing. All right, so if you want to sell to somebody, great way to start with the end of the story. And then, here's the ending. Here was the beginning, and then we'll show you how I got to the ending and what I did to make that change. But there's one other thing. If you really want to make a point, there's one point in your story you really want to get across, there's yet another way. tell that story. You may have heard there's 2 sides to every story. Well, now you know there's actually 3 sides to every story. Tell a story from the beginning all the way through to the end. Tell a story at the end. Then talk about the beginning. There's yet one other way. One other way you may not have thought about. You may not use that much. But if you want to get that point across to your audience, and that point's in your story, it's going to be really effective. And that is, begin in the middle. Begin in the middle of your story. Because sometimes in a story, it really isn't such a big deal about how it begins. If you've got a story how you made this kind of a life or death decision, start with a life or death decision. There I was, at the top of the mountain, wondering, how do I get down again? That's the middle of the story. Obviously, there's something to come after that, because you're talking to them. You're telling the speaker talking to the audience, so somehow you got off that mountain. And on the other hand, it's pretty clear that's not the beginning of the story. And the first thing I did was I went out and I made sure I got all the right climbing equipment and I got my backpack on. But that's boring. So you skip all that and you go right to the middle of the story, and then you can kind of build out from there. So if your point is about what to do if you're stuck, what to do if you're stuck in some situation and you start out, there I am at the top of the mountain, trying to figure out how to get down. That's your point? That's the point of the story? Start with that. Beginning with the middle of the story takes the right type of speech. I mean, if your speech is all about a kind of a process, here's the way I got millions of dollars, maybe you don't want to really begin in the middle. But if you've got a really one strong point in that story, and you want to get that point across the audience, then beginning in the middle is very helpful. The great thing you begin in the middle is you also create a mystery about 2 things. You create a mystery about how did you get up to the mountain, and you create a mystery how did you get down from the mountain. And by having 2 mysteries, that can also generate interest in the story. Your typical story, told from beginning to end, its mystery basically is what's going to happen next. Right? If you begin at the end, you already know the climax of the story, so there's no mystery involved. The only question is, how did you do that? But you know the result. Begin in the middle. 2 mysteries. One is, how did you get to that situation? And 2 is, how are you going to get out of that situation? Beginning with the middle does also take the right story construction. If you just begin in the middle of any story, it may not be that effective, especially if your story really isn't just about one point. If your story is more about the result, it makes sense to begin with the end. If your story is more about this is how the guy overcame these different conflicts, it makes sense to begin at the beginning. But if you've got a story, you really want to get that point across, begin in the middle. And once you begin in the middle, make sure you tell people a little bit about, you start answering some of those questions in their mind, like, how did you get up to the top of the mountain? Well, you can explain that as you go on in the story. Here I am at the top of the mountain. 10 days ago, seemed like a crazy idea to climb up to a mountain. Something like that. And then later on, of course, explain how you got off the mountain. Beginning in the middle can be very effective because it's surprising. Something people just don't expect. So if you use it well, effectively, you can pull people into that speech, get them thinking of things in a different way, and really make that point powerfully stick in your audience's mind. All right, just to wrap things up and recap all the things you've learned today. You've learned there are three ways, three very powerful ways to handle time in a story. And the first one is the simplest. Just begin at the beginning and then just go all the way through to the end. Simple, straightforward, not a big deal. But do remember, build the conflict. Some problem, some situation has to come up. Not just once, but over and over again. The more you build that conflict, the more you build the story. People get interested in the story by wanting to know what's going to happen next. So every time you've got a situation coming up or somebody's making a decision, make some sort of problem happen. Make it difficult for them. Make things get really bad, and that'll build your story. Second way to handle time in a story you learned about today is to begin the story at the end. Take the end, move it to the beginning. Especially if you want to get people interested in how did you do it. If you want to motivate them, if you've got some end result, and you want to motivate people to get to that, you want to tell them how to get there, begin with the end. Wow, here's where you could be. And then go to the beginning. I started out down here. I'm here today. That's the end. But I started out down here. And I worked my way up using a process you're going to learn today. And beginning at the end, already people know this is what I'm going to get out of it. You think, okay, I'd like to have millions of dollars. Sounds good. How do I do it? And that gets them interested and gets them following the story. And the final way to handle time in a story you learned about was to begin in the middle of the story. You use this when you want to make a particular point. There's some point in the story you really want to make and make it clear, and that point is just central to the entire story. Begin at that point. Instead of trying to begin at the beginning and build up to it, or beginning at the end and then kind of have the point fall somewhere in the middle, begin with that powerful point right at the beginning. And then you pull people in, get them interested, get them thinking, oh, okay, how does that work? So you can start out a speech, there I am at the top of the mountain, wondering how to get down. Then you've got two ways to build. What happened before and what happened afterwards. How did you get up the top of the mountain? What happens afterwards? Always that central point of there's the mountain. That's the point I want to get across. It's all about the mountain. It's all about the trip down. That's the whole thing that I want to get across to you, the audience. So begin at the middle. Now you might be thinking, Tim, this is a lot of work, a lot of bother. When I tell a story, I just want to tell a story. Just kind of let it all flow, whatever happened, just kind of let it just kind of bubble out. Whatever happens, happens, wherever it begins. If I want to begin 2/3 of the way through it and start from there, I will. And that's fine if you don't have any purpose to your talk. If you're just talking up there just to, talk, and it doesn't really matter whether the audience pays attention, begin the story whatever you want. But if you've got an interesting story or a powerful story and you really want to get it across, think about, do you want to begin at the beginning? Talk about the conflicts in the way? It's more about trying to get people to understand and buy into a process of getting something they want. Begin at the end. Or is there a powerful point you really get across with this story? You can begin in the middle. Depends on the purpose of your talk. Once you start using these techniques, discover it's It's a power place up here on stage. It really is. And when you're up here, you're large and in charge and really up there with everybody. Find out that it's not a big deal to connect with the audience, provided you're using the right sense of time in your stories. It's a simple process. Begin at the beginning, begin at the end, begin at the middle. And as you start speaking more, you start enjoying things. Your audience enjoys it because they know the speech is relevant to them, it works for them, it's important for them. And you feel good because the audience feels good. The audience feels good, you feel good, it just builds from there. So, your next story, just try to figure out what type of a three-timer are you?